Lovely introduction, thank you. It makes you feel really old when somebody stands there and talks about things you've done over a period of, 30 years. And so it's like, oh, I did this thing. I'm still here. So thanks. So there are a couple chairs here if anyone would like to grab them. This one can be brought there, so quick in the corner, and then there's an extra. Okay, so first of all, can people in the back hear me okay? Raise your hand if you can hear me okay. Awesome. I don't usually need a mic because I am a fairly loud person. So I'm going to talk today, as Ali said, I'm going to give you an overview of some of my work. And this is sort of a distillation, but also an introduction to some of the theoretical models, some of my empirical work. And I wanted to start by saying a few words about myself. I spoke yesterday to Maria, professor who gave this class, and mentioned a couple things about my background that I think are important to know to understand my work. One is that I am I'm binational, I guess you'd call it. My father is Brazilian, my mother's American. I grew up around the world in different places, and this very much informs the kind of work I do, as you'll see. And then the other thing is that I have an interdisciplinary background. So my undergrad degree was in psychology. I went to a small liberal arts college. Then I went to the University of Chicago, where I was in the Committee on Human Development, which is an interdisciplinary human development program. I had various postdocs, including in public health at Johns Hopkins, and then my first teaching job was at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where I was in the psychology department, and I was in the development of the Psych program, and then I made the switch to human development and human studies. And so I draw on a lot of different schools of thought in my work. So my task today, in 30 to 40 minutes, is to do three things. So I'm going to try to do three things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the theoretical frameworks that underpin my work. And I always like to talk about theory because it really is important to guide what you're studying and why you're studying it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my empirical studies, focusing especially on topics of how culture and contextual perspectives can be integrated into work on adolescent risk and resilience. And I'm going to give examples from studies conducted in Mexico and Brazil. Well, I'm going to have to skip some of the later stuff. And then if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about future directions, what I'm doing now with my students. And my goal is to save time for Q&A. So I'm going to go fairly quickly, but stop me if you have questions. And if I start talking too fast, just throw something at me because I do that. Okay. So let me start with some theories. So little Russian nesting dolls. I put this up here because one of the key theoretical frameworks I use is the bioecological model. And I'll talk a little bit about that and the Russian nesting dolls. I'm also working within a cultural psychology framework, I guess we'd call it, and developmental psychopathology and resilience science. So I'm going to say a little bit about each of these three theoretical frameworks, just to give you some background about how I think about the topics I study. So let me start with this. So, sorry, I'm putting all those up because I haven't, they were supposed to go together. So, how many of you have heard the name Yuri Bronfenbrenner? Okay, probably those of you who've taken developmental psychology. Right? So, Yuri Bronfenbrenner proposed or developed what is called the bioecological model. And this is a model to understand how individual development occurs. So he was a developmental psychologist, and he talked about development being the product of three different things. And I won't have time to go into these in detail, but I want to give you a little bit of a flavor. So Yuri, as we all call him, because too long, Yuri talked about the person, process, context, and time. So the person refers to the individual who's developing and their characteristics. So things like age, gender, etc., ethnicity, disability status. These characteristics affect how individuals grow up, how they're treated by other people, and how they respond to the world. He also talks about process because development is dynamic. So development is the outgrowth of interactions between the developing person and the environment. And this concept stresses that we can't understand development unless we look at how interactions occur, dynamics of exchange, and how those change over time. So you can't look at anything in isolation, you can't look at it in a static fashion. Context refers to the environment in which the individual participates, and I'm going to say more about that in a second. And then time refers to the patterning of events, both in individual life and history. So anyone who's taken development or anyone who's been a child knows that you are not the same as you are like at age 2, age 5, age 7, age 10. You're changing and the world changes around you as your interactions change. So this individual time is important to consider. And then there's the notion of historical time, which is that all of us are developing in a particular time and place. And the events of the past continue to affect the present. And this is a little more unusual maybe for psychologists who are often thinking about individuals or individuals and families. But I'll take an example that many of you can probably relate to, which is if you think about past experiences of colonization, or in the US, we have a history of slavery that has continued to affect the experiences of African Americans. The systems of structures were set up that continue to control and in many ways oppress individuals of African American backgrounds. Countries have gone through war, countries have gone through conflict. All of those conditions have long-lasting effects on individuals. And when I come to talk about my work on homeless kids in Brazil, this will be more apparent because it's a very important strategy. So within Bronfenbrenner's model, I said I'd come back to context. I'm going to show you this picture, which is very complicated, but you've all probably seen it. So within the model, the developing person is in the middle with those characteristics I talked about. And then they're surrounded by increasingly distant layers or context. So Bronfenbrenner talked about microsystems, which are things like the family, the peer group, the school. Places or contexts or environments individuals participate in directly. And then you have mesosystems, which are the connections between those. You have exosystems and macrosystems. Now, obviously, I don't expect you to absorb all this information, but really it is intended to illustrate the idea that to understand the developing person, we have to think not only what they're situated in right now, but of all the things around them that might affect their functioning through laws, policy, values, beliefs. So, this is Bronfenbrenner's model. It's been used very, very widely to understand and explain human development. So my question when I started working, or as I'm working with this, is where is culture in this model? Does anyone see culture in Bronfenbrenner's model? Right. So in Bronfenbrenner's model, culture was out, where is it? I don't even know if it's on this one. Attitudes and ideologies of the culture. So it's out there. But it's out where it belongs. So cultural psychologists will tell us other things. So cultural psychology would tell us that culture is a cross-cutting influence that pervades everything you do. From how individuals think and react to the world, to how children are socialized, and how family members interact, how communities and societies are organized. So when you think about Bronfenbrenner's model and working for culture, I would argue it's in the wrong place. So this is just a basic definition of culture. So culture can be defined as a set of principles guiding how members of a group live their lives and socialize the next generation. And culture is manifested in values, beliefs, and behavior. So culture can be defined as beliefs, things you think about, things you hold dear, can be defined as practices, can be defined as many other things. So from a cultural perspective, Bronfenbrenner's model should have this, because culture pervades or cuts across all of these layers of the model. So I would argue that you can infuse culture throughout the model, or you have to understand culture as being infused across the model, and as a pervasive force that we need to consider. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I've done that in my work. So those are two of the strands that inform my work, the ecological perspective and culture. The third one is going to be familiar to many of you, especially if you take Psych, which is developmental psychopathology. So how many of you have studied developmental psychopathology in a class? Okay, so a group of you. So basically, developmental psychopathology is the study of psychological problems. This perspective talks about how individual development can be disrupted through experiences of risk. And within developmental psychopathology, we talk about risk factors, which are events or conditions that increase the probability of physical, psychological, or social problems. And I've listed some examples on the slide. These can be biological issues, personal issues, family, social, or stressful. So these risk factors, when they occur, increase the likelihood that a person, for example, might become depressed or develop anxiety or PTSD, any of an array of problems. Now, a general principle coming out of developmental psychopathology is illustrated in this graph, which is that risk exposure, so here is risk level, so 0 risk to 6 risk, it's like meta-analysis type stuff, problems increasing. So generally, as the risk level increases, the level of problems increase. And if you're interested in this topic, there's some excellent work by Emily Warner and her colleagues who've been studying a birth cohort, started studying a birth cohort of kids born on the island of Hawaii and followed them for many, many years. And they've written books about what happened to those individuals as they grow up. Now this graph shows a linear relationship between risk and problems. So the more risks you have, the more problems you have. But that doesn't always happen. So these dots indicate people who have worse outcomes than expected given their risk. So they have low risk but high levels of problem. And these dots indicate people who have lower levels of problems, so low problems, given despite high levels of risk. And the white dots indicate people who are exhibiting what's called resilience. They are doing better than expected given the level of risk they're experiencing. So resilience is this manifestation of good adjustment, positive adjustment, despite exposure to threat or adversity. So sometimes we talk about people being able to bounce back from adversity or not surrender to adversity. Originally, this term was used to describe individuals, and more broadly now it's used to describe systems. And so scholars have expanded their understanding of resilience to think about what is the capacity of a system. That could be an individual person, it could be a family, it could be a community, it could be a country. And that allows us to think of multiple systems and how they can maintain or recover their equilibrium. And it also allows us to think about multiple areas of functioning that people might exhibit good or bad adaptation. Now, I don't have time to show you this great clip, but it's in the slide I'm going to be leaving. So anyone who's interested in resilience, I totally encourage you to watch this. This is Ann Maston's SRTD presidential address. And she is one of the main figures in resilience science right now. If you go on YouTube, you can find her. Just Google Ann Maston SRTD. And the clip that I normally show, I'm actually teaching a class on this in a couple of weeks, is from about 7 minutes to 12 minutes, where she talks about where the science of resilience originated, and traces its roots back to after World War II and the founding parents of resilience science. But we don't have time for that. Sorry, no videos. Okay, so within the developmental risk and resilience model or theories, protective factors are an important part. So you have risk and you have outputs. So why do some people demonstrate resilience? Well, the presence of protective factors allows them to do that. So protective factors are defined as things, that's very scientific, things that modify, diminish the impact of risk factors. So they can be characteristics of the individual, the family, or the social environment. So let's get a little audience participation. What are some examples of individual protective factors that have been described? So those of you who've taken anything on this. Yes.
A secure attachment to your parent
So
figure.
a secure attachment to a caretaker. What else? Yes.
Mentors.
What else? Individuals. Yes.
Charming personality.
Yeah. So those are factors that change or allow you to elicit care and support. Self-efficacy is another one. Optimism is very important. Cognitive skills. Family characteristics can include things like warmth and cohesion. And then broader social networks can include supportive teachers, mentors, friends, community organizations. So if you think about the campus and what helps you maintain resilience or helps you overcome adversity, it might be things like, I can't remember the name of them, the people who work with students, student support services. And these may be internal factors or external factors. Okay, so that's kind of the three theories that undergird my work. This idea of contextual perspective and ecological perspective, the role of culture, and then the notion of developmental psychopathology, a little more broadly the notion of resilience. So how do I take those and put them together? Whoops, sorry. But it's not a class, so I will just skip it. So I've tried to bring these three strands together in various ways. And to give you a sense of this work, I'm going to discuss two studies conducted in two different populations. At least I think I'm going to try. Okay. So the first study is kind of a nice and simple example because it was a very clean analysis. So this is a study that was published in the journal Research on Adolescence, and it was conducted in central Mexico. I have a collaboration with a large group of colleagues at Nebraska and, at Illinois. I've been in Nebraska a long time. It's Maria's making me crazy. So you see some of us at the University of Illinois, some of us are in central Mexico. And in this paper, what we did is study the interplay of stress, depression, and social support. And you're all psych majors, so I'm sure you've all heard of the stress buffering hypothesis. So this is basically a test of the stress buffering hypothesis in a Mexican sample. That's what we call it. So why did we look at this in Mexico? Well, Mexico is a very interesting context. There's a lot of very interesting things happening there. And I'm assuming since we're in California, how many people here are Mexican or Mexican American? No people we don't know. Mexico is fascinating for a number of reasons. So it has a young population. Unlike the US, where the median age is, I've forgotten, much more than 25. The median age in Mexico is 25 years. So lots of young people. And it's also rapidly changing. So these young people are coming of age in a society that's undergoing a lot of change. And there's a lot of economic and educational uncertainty. So educational opportunities are expanding, but there is still limited access at the post-secondary level. So there's a lot of competition. And also Mexican youth face high levels of unemployment. There's quite a bit of poverty still. And depending on where you are in Mexico, there's quite a bit of drug-related violence. So I don't want you, the whole country is not characterized by these issues, but in the area where I was working, or am working, there's a lot of issues people are contending with. And because of this, or in light of this, it's not surprising that Mexican youth report high levels of both stress and mental health difficulties. And depending on the study, whether you look at clinical or non-clinical measures, anywhere between 3 and 25% of the sample are manifesting depressive symptomatologies at subclinical levels. So in this study, I'm going to go quite quickly over the methods just to give you a sense. We studied college applicants in a town that has about 800,000 inhabitants. And as part of the application process, so when students are applying to college, they come to campus, they fill out a bunch of papers, they have a medical exam. And then we got IRB approval, or our colleagues got IRB approval to invite them to participate in the research. And if they consented, well, we got parental consent and then child consent. And then If they consented, they did a questionnaire and also could release their medical records to us. So it's a very thorough data set. And so our data set for this analysis is about 7,000 16 to 21-year-olds. We limited it to unmarried people, which was about 98% of the sample, and those were complete data. So I think we had about 97% of the kids who would agree to participate. And the average age was about 18 years and about half were women. We did a number of structured measures, and I'm not going to go through them except to say that these are all standard measures that we had previously adapted for use in the context. So they did demographics, they did the perceived stress scale, Mexican Spanish language version, which measured how much stress they experienced. We measured depressive symptoms using the CESD, another standard measure of depression. And we did examine social support using a standard measure called a multidimensional scale of perceived social support. And this measure is interesting because it has 3 subscales. I'll talk about why we wanted these subscales and then the overall global assessment. And all of the measures had pretty good psychometric properties. Now, what did we find? So, as expected, and I should say this is a cross-sectional analysis. So that's important to remember because we're going to have higher confusion. But as we expected, depression and stress were strongly correlated. So the correlation was 0.51. But what I did here for more visual, to make it easier to see, I broke the sample into low stress, medium stress, and high stress. And this is level of depression. So you can see there's a strong linear relationship between stress and depression. So our question here was really, does social support function as a protective factor? Does it change the association between depression and stress? Do kids who have more social support, are they better able to cope with the stress in their lives? And so again, I'm not going to bore you with all the details of the analysis. What we did, we tested the moderating of social support in a regression analysis. And I have a figure showing our main finding. Okay, so what this figure shows then is respondents who reported low stress, respondents who reported high stress. There's depression, so that's the same. But then we broke it up by whether they had low levels of global social support or high levels of social support. And so what you can see, the top line shows that association where more stress was associated with more depressive symptoms. Right? There's a slope. So that's the same pattern as we saw earlier. But that's only true for youth who have low levels of social support. The bottom line is flat. That means that levels of depression are similar regardless of level of stress. Right? There's no change in the level of depression based on the level of stress. So that suggests that when levels of support are high, higher levels of stress are not associated with higher levels of depression. So in the language of resilience, social support functions as a protective factor. Any questions about this before I continue? Yes.
The multi-level scale said it was perceived levels of social support.
Right, it's a perception of social support.
Who, is it the person answering the questionnaire, what they perceive?
Yeah. That's a good question, yes. It's all self-report. Was there a hand at the back or was that here? Okay. So one of the things that really interests me, because of my interest in culture and differences across nations, is whether family functions as a culturally salient protective factor. So in the U.S., there's a lot has been written about how during adolescence, young people turn from the family to the peer group as major sources of support. And in the U.S., that in fact has been shown that peers, that maybe they don't replace family, but they become more salient in many ways. But we thought things might be different in Mexico because there's been a lot written about the family, the importance of the family. In Mexico, families are often very cohesive. young people often remain in the parental home until they marry. And so we thought the relationship between parents and adolescents and their parents might be different. So in a follow-up analysis, we looked at support from family, friends, and significant others in separate analyses, and then we looked at them together. So when we looked at them individually, so each of these in a separate regression model, support from family, peers, and romantic partners all show the same patterns as global social support, what I just showed you. So regardless of the source, support was protective. But when we did a test of, we put all three of those types of support in the same model, so we tested them together, only family support had a buffering effect. So the only, I'm trying not to be too statistical, so the only significant regression coefficient in the model was family support. Support from peers and significant others did not have that protective effect. Okay, so what did this study tell us? Well, it told us two things. The first was that we confirmed the stress buffering hypothesis in the Mexican population. Why is that important? It's important because the best way to test our theories and our models of development is to replicate them in novel populations. There's been a lot of research done in the US, mostly with college students, not always. And so taking those theories and testing them in another population gives us a sense of whether our research findings provide support for theoretical models. So theoretically, this was important. And then the other thing that, to me, was way more exciting or interesting was that the findings shed light on the role of family support. The results highlight the importance of the family and suggest that family support will play a unique role in protecting Mexican youth from the negative impact of stress. And so, as the next step, we're going to be examining the structure and function of Mexican youth family networks and trying to understand what's going on. So did they have more support? Is support for the families most important because they're living with their parents? Or is it something about the family context in Mexico? For my work with Mexican American young people, I actually think there's something different going on in that population. There is definitely, the family plays a different role, and the expectations for family use relationships seem to be somewhat different. So that's where I'm going next with that. Okay, so this is acknowledgments. I'm looking at the time and trying to figure out how I'm doing. How am I doing, Maria? Another 10 minutes, right? Good. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk a little bit. So that was one set of studies that demonstrates sort of how I bring these different models together and test mainstream psychological theories and models. And I'm going to shift completely and talk about another line of research. So one of the great things about being an academic is you can do really, you can do whatever you want in terms of your research. Well, as long as you can follow IRB procedures. But you can study different things, and you can study things that interest you, and you can choose to keep studying them or not. So I want to talk now about work in a completely different context that I've been doing for over 20 years, which is work on what used to be called street kids, but we no longer call them that. It's seen as pejorative. So these are young people who spend a lot of time on the streets. In the old days, they used to mostly live. You could see kids living on the streets, working on the streets. As the economic situation really has changed, what you see more are kids involved in drug trafficking and other forms of street-involved populations. So this is a really complicated topic. So let me give you a flavor of what it is about, what do kids living on the street tell us? So what do we need to think about to really understand this population? Because we can't think of them as just a bunch of dysfunctional kids who run away from home and live on the street. These kids are embedded in a larger, very complex system, and they're the endpoint of hundreds of years of history. So, their presence on the street reflects historical events, including colonization, control of the economy by the elites, military dictatorship, intervention by foreign governments like the US, structural inequalities, and policies aimed at controlling youth and repressing youth. Brazil had the longest military dictatorship in Latin America. And so even though that was ended in 1985, the legacy of the structures that were implemented still remain. So there's all of this background that we have to think about. The presence of kids on the street also reflects cultural constructions of childhood. And an example, which is a great ethnography written in the 1990s by Tobias Hecht, discusses the distinction between what he calls nurtured children, so those whose parents are able to take care of them, and nurturing children, so nurturing children who make contributions to their impoverished family. And he makes the points that these children are present throughout Brazil's history, and actually throughout global history. And these views of childhood shape how street youth are viewed and how they view themselves. Then there's also a lot of cultural elements related to the construction of race and class. I alluded to the history of slavery. That's been very much continues to affect Brazil. There's also class and gender was brought from there, class and gender. And then there's sort of this public imaginary about what it means to be on the street. So there are traditional notions that portray the home as the appropriate place for women and the street as the appropriate place for men. So there's sort of all of these complicated ideas mixing in. So kids on the street experience multiple adversities. Poverty, parental death, dangerous neighborhoods. And I'll show you some data on that in a minute. And they're at risk of negative developmental outcomes. There's tons of data about this. They may use substances, they may engage in sex, and they also experience external threats in the form of violence. So by any standard, these are very high risk. These kids are at high risk. But there's a lot in the literature, and if you talk to some of these kids, they'll often report positive adaptation and life satisfaction. And so so they'll say, I'm fine, I'm doing great, I like my life. Sometimes because the life they had at home was so terrible, but by comparison. So my question my colleagues and I started working on is really what factors allow some street kids to grow up well? I don't have a lot of time to walk you through the details, but I just want to share a couple of findings from a study we recently completed. So this is a longitudinal study that my colleague Sylvia Colvett and I conducted with two of her former students. We collected data in 3 Brazilian cities, so Porto Alegre, which is down here in the south, Salvador, Fortaleza. And the goal of the study was to generate information about the development of Brazilian street kids in order to develop interventions. So again, I'm not going to talk much, but just give you an idea of what we did. The study was mixed method and longitudinal. We collected both qual and quant data. And the study occurred over an 18-month period. We conducted what we call ecological engagement in youth settings. So our researchers, who are all grad students and undergrads, went into institutions, shelters, and street settings where the kids were found and engaged with them on an ongoing basis. And we did observations. Then we conducted structured data collection at 6-month intervals. At the first time point, we did 2 separate interviews, a life history interview, which was qualitative and open-ended, and an assessment of current status, which was structured. And then at time 2 and time 3, so 6 and 12 months, we repeated the current status assessment. So we have a ton of data which we are now drowning or swimming in, depending on how I feel. But let me tell you a little bit about what we have started analyzing. And I want to share with you a small bit of information. So this is just a subset of the constructs we have on our current status assessment. So risk factors, we looked at a variety, including adverse life events. And the asterisks are the ones I'm going to mention today. We looked at current life events at each time point. We looked at deviance resistance strategies. We looked at protective factors, including social support networks, and 2 constructs I'll talk about, street smarts and life satisfaction. And then we looked at a range of adjustment indicators, including physical health, positive and negative affect, substance use, etc. So we have a lot of data. We have multiple graduate students who are doing master's theses and dissertations. We have a couple of undergrads, and my colleagues and I are doing data analysis. It's great. So anyone who speaks Portuguese and wants to go to grad school, after that. So to give you a quick sense of the sample, we recruited 113 kids, reflecting the general population on the street. Most were boys, average age was 14, and managed to retain 72 and 62% of them, which is not great, but for a mobile population like this, we're actually pretty excited. So just to give you a quick glimpse into some of the data. So during the life history interview, we asked about adverse life events. The interviews were done as an open-ended interview to avoid leading the kids too much. And so what happened was the interviewers, as we asked the kids to tell us their life story, as they told their story, the interviewer would go through this structured checklist we had and check off. And then at the end of the interview, they went back and confirmed the events that occurred, asked for more details, and then asked about any that were not mentioned. And you reported between 7 and 28 life events. And I'm going to show you some of these events. These are major life events. And the average was about 17, which is a lot. Okay, so what were the life events? This just shows some of the main ones in the different areas. So we break them down as family events like parental death, parental divorce or separation, imprisonment of a family member, street-related events, things really related to being on the street, like death threats because you're in the drug trade, leaving the family to live on the street, being institutionalized in jail. We have individual events like being expelled from school, socioeconomic events, which basically is poverty, having to start working with your family, and then various forms of violence. So this is a comprehensive assessment of adverse life events that we have developed across years of research with describing the population, trying to understand their situation. So, I'm going to stop in a minute. Right, Maria? Maria's nodding yes. What did we find? We found that adverse life events measured at time 1 were associated with time 2 adjustment. The reason we're looking at adjustment in time 2 is because we wanted to have some space between the timing of the 2 measurements. Because sometimes when you interview a person, there's a tendency for them to respond in a certain way. And we wanted to make sure to separate time 1 and time 2. So this is 6-month separation between the one measured adverse life event and adjustment. And you can see there's a positive, significant correlation between level of adversity and negative affect, physical symptoms rated by the interviewer. So this was self-reported, negative affect. This is rated by the interviewer, and this is self-reported. So adversity is related to these 3 areas of adjustment. And I threw it in a figure again, just to make it easier. So gray are those who experience relatively low levels of stressful life events, and red are the high. And you can see that in all cases, level of negative affect is higher for those with more negative life events, physical symptoms, and these drugs. So we're seeing that dose response, as they say, the higher level of risk, more problems. Okay. Currently, we're looking at whether, I'm going to stop in a minute, whether anything functions as a protective factor, but I will quickly give you the take-home message, which is no. So far, none of the things we've tested appear to allow kids to maintain good functioning. So we've looked at street smarts, which is like a culturally sensitive way to measure intelligence. We looked at individual optimism. Nothing's working. So, skip this result slide. So basically, we haven't found anything that confers resilience. So now we're figuring out why. Here's where we can have some discussion. I have some thoughts about this. I'd love to hear more. So one of the things we're toying with is that The literature shows that the identification of potential protective factors must be tailored to specific outcomes. So we're trying to make sure we're looking at the right ones. The other is that there's a lot of literature showing that in extremely difficult situations, protective factors individual protective factors will not help you adjust. You need to fix the context, not the person. And so we're considering protective factors at other levels of the ecology, especially going back to the data and working. Okay. And then I just want to thank people and show you a picture of my colleagues. So these are people. This is my colleague, Sylvia. She's doing a year at Harvard right now. She's a visiting professor there. This is Juliana, who's actually doing 5 months at my institution. And this is Normanda, the other PI. And she's a professor. Her student is coming to spend like 6 months with me next year. Okay, I'm done. Sorry, Maria. I told her I'm going to have to go because I don't know. So, questions, comments?
Since you didn't come to any complete conclusions about what does it, are you going to repeat the study and find more information?
That's a great question. Actually, my colleague Juliana is continuing to follow up the young people she recruited in her city, and we've been adding some different types of questions. I don't anticipate doing another study, but my colleagues in Brazil, they're younger, they're a lot younger than I am, except for Sylvia, who's retiring this year. So they're going to be doing more data collection. Yeah, it's hard. We have a lot of really good case study data that suggests what can be very protective for the kids is to be adopted, for example, taken in by the family. So being completely removed from the context of the street and the institution and put in a different context. But that didn't happen to enough kids for us to know, to be able to test it statistically. So what we're starting to do is we've shifted to more of a case study approach, and we've gone back to all of the data we collected, and we're creating individual case studies for each of the kids in the study to try to do a more qualitative assessment of what's going on with the kid and how things work. Taking cuts a long time. We have a lot of data, and also just trying to just. That's a good question. There are a lot of young people doing really good research. Other question? Yes.
How did you find kids? Like, how did you teach them to do like spend a lot of time still
Yep.
to background?
So that's a great question. So the question is, how do we determine whether they spend a lot of time on the street? So the ecological engagement process I mentioned, part of it was designed to allow our staff to get to know kids and observe them, sort of talk to them informally. We had a strict set of inclusion criteria which were included that they have to have been on the streets in some way, shape, or form. So either living on the street, working on the street, spending time on the street, engaging in a set of activities, there's illicit activities. And so we worked to first get to know the kids and identify them, and then those that fit our criteria were the ones we recruited. And that's why we did 6 months of this ecological engagement in each city before we even recruited our participants to get it exactly that. And then we asked questions that will now allow us to go back and see, for example, how many of the kids spend significant time on the street, or coding why they were on the street. So they go to the street because they wanted to use drugs. Did they go to the street because they were kicked out of their house? So we have sort of a coding scheme for reasons to go to the street. So we did both sort of beforehand. We tried to make sure they fit our criteria, and then we measured the things that we were using as a criteria. So we can. We actually took a couple people out of the samples and we realized we're not. They were recruited in the shelters of the street kids, but they didn't have any significant street experience. So we actually excluded them. They just happened to be there. That's a good question. Other questions? Yeah.
So let's say that homelessness results to be more of a negative outcome for some. were you able to find any factors that maybe like motives for homeless who that could actually lead into a non-statistically significant extent where that protects them, as adults?
Yeah, so there's a big discussion about this actually where researchers have found in some contexts, including in Brazil and there's some research in Nepal, that kids who are surviving on the streets are better off than kids who are in very impoverished communities at home, because the kids on the street have access to more resources. For example, they can beg, they can get food from people. There are lots of institutions to serve the kids, whereas the kids who are in very impoverished, in Nepal, we're comparing rural villages, urban slums, and kids on the street. And they find that the health status of the kids who are on the street is better. So going to the street may be a survival strategy because they have access to things they don't otherwise have. And also many of these kids come from extremely dysfunctional homes, so leaving is a sign of strength in the sense that I'm tired of getting beaten up or abused. The problem is that a strategy that ensures short-term survival may not be the best one because these kids are subjected to all sorts of violence. We've tracked kids longitudinally and we find that not in this study, the things in Brazil have really changed, but in the 1990s and early the death rates in our sample of kids dying for various reasons was higher than in some studies of suicide survivors. And suicide survivors have about the highest attrition rates of any study sample. Because once you try to kill yourself, you try to kill. So our death rates are really high. So on the one hand, going to the street can be seen as a sign of strength, but on the other hand, growing up process can be really problematic. And that's why my colleague wants to follow these kids. So one thing that happens in Brazil up here, we've probably heard the term aging out of the foster care system. So kids who are in foster care have a lot of resources and protected, but then when they're, it depends on the state, 18, 21, whatever, it's like, bye, right? You're all grown up now, go have a life. So that happens in Brazil, it's at 18 for the kids, it's 18 is the age of majority. So at 18, kids are basically kicked out of the shelter they've been in. There's some halfway houses, but there are not enough of them. So we're trying to study some of our participants as they transition into 18 and beyond and see what happens to them. And that's why I wanted to do research with some folks. Yes.
Do you think there's a risk or a concern that the westernized concept of adolescence is playing into your study because particularly with First Nations and indigenous culture, children were already adults at age 12, 13, and so I don't know if that's a strength from a cultural standpoint, and I'm not much of an expert for South America, particularly in Brazil, but I'm wondering if even tackling that here in adolescence in a non-westernized area might be a factor.
That's a
Can you
great
address that
question. Yeah, that's a really good question. We've actually talked about that a lot. Brazil is fairly westernized in the sense that the sort of notion of adolescence are fairly well developed. What we've talked about or criticized mostly is the notion of emerging adulthood, which really doesn't fit in Brazil because some of the kids, as you said, even as an adolescent. But the notion of being an adolescent in Brazil maybe is a little different because except for middle-class families, adolescents have never really had the freedoms that many adolescents have. But the notion of adolescence as a somewhat protected period has become more common in Brazil now because they were one of the few First Nations to have, well, they had their own convention on the rights of child right around the time that the UN Convention was implemented. And so since the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has been implemented, Brazil has put in a whole array of structures to protect the rights of children and adolescents. So there's a lot of discourse around what are the rights of children and adolescents. So at least in urban areas, I think the notion is very well entrenched. I think in the more probably rural areas and tribal areas in the Amazon, probably it's more like that. And in fact, Brazil outlawed child labor maybe 10, 15 years ago. And before that, you would see kids Brazilian schools only operate on a half day. So a lot of kids would go to school either in the afternoon and then they'd work. And that was completely seen as acceptable because they were contributing to their families. But then when Brazil signed the Convention on the Child, one of the things you have to do is ban child labor. So they did a huge, it was a huge investment in getting rid of child labor and also in giving families alternative ways to make money. And so fortunately, so there was this really great period where the economy was booming. There was a progressive, left-leaning federal government, so the president Lula, you probably hear a lot about now because all this disruption stuff going on, but he was great because he developed a lot of policies that allowed impoverished families to invest in their children and keep them in school as opposed to putting them to work. So I think, yeah, the Western adolescence is more commonly acknowledged. Other questions? Yeah.
Did you do in the practice and stuff any identification of adolescents with different sexual identities?
Right,
that make a difference?
Yeah. So one of the undergraduates who worked on the project has done analysis of the LGBT youth in our sample. And actually, that there are quite a few because one of the reasons kids get kicked out of the house is because of their all sexuality. And so he hasn't published anything in English yet, but he's done several conference presentations and he's doing an honors. But I can't remember finding it off the top of my head. I can give it to you. He actually wrote it. He presented it as far as so you see how the history is. See me after this, I have a Are we out of time?
There's not a class in the lobby, so just want to keep going.
Any more questions?
I have one, I guess it should be like for future directions, or it should be something that maybe you noticed. You mentioned the heck, what you wrote about nurture children and nurture schools. Was there something that, because like in a lot of senses, culture is built in that kind of nurture setting? Did you notice anything, or maybe perhaps that's something that you're looking forward into, like how that affects communities or protective factors for some of these?
That's a really good question, yeah.
Nurturing or nurturing?
So, yeah. I'm actually trying to think if we collected data that would allow us to take advantage of that. We do know if the kids had the work to support their families, if that was part of the yeah, let's think about that. That's a good question. The context has changed since Heck wrote his book. Nowadays, kids are found on the street and they get picked up and reported and their parents get in trouble. And so the context has changed, so it's harder for kids to be that kind of nurturing in the sense of supporting their family and working to support them. But many of the kids do significant amounts of child care and helping out and doing things to help their parents, like kids do here.
Yeah.
So that's still possible. But it's been, I mean, one of the interesting things working there for all this time is how much it's changed. So actually we're writing a paper right now on the changing context of the street and comparing the kids we studied now with the kids we studied 20 years ago because we have 20 years of data we can look at. And the reasons for going to the street and to what's going on. And one thing we found so far is that drugs play a huge role, much huger than they used to. So in the past, a lot of kids would be on the street because they were poor and they were working or they wanted to go play at the beach. And frankly, their home lives were often very miserable. But now what we're finding is so many of the kids we study are like they went to the street either because they're using drugs or they're selling drugs or it wasn't safe for them to be in their neighborhood because they were involved in drug trafficking. So my colleague is writing a paper on the role of drugs in street kids over the years. And, in fact, as we speak, she's working on that because I left her with she's like, I'm going to have a draft of our paper when you get back. And I was like, great. So yeah, so that's one thing that's really changed. More questions?
Okay, so you said that when you were working with the sample kids, a lot of them, you said drugs play a huge role, usually. Did you ever feel like, you're kind of somewhat in danger not having that information with you, hoping that knowing that these children know about you and then they can go ahead and just tell like whoever they're working for and they can come looking for you and kind of like get you for your money and whatnot? Was that ever like an offending?
So, yes. So one of the things we did to make sure our interviewers were safe, we had a whole bunch of safeguards, including, going to places together. But we just finished up, we're looking at retention and attrition, and we looked at all the reasons that we stopped following participants, and there were actually a fair number where the reason we stopped was because it was no longer safe for the interviewer to work with them. Either because the kids said, hey, you can't come around and my dealer will get mad, or because the interviewers just didn't feel safe going to the neighborhoods. So that was an issue. We didn't send people usually into very unsafe environments. They would have the kids come and work. That was something we thought about a lot. And also just things, like giving contact information and who you leave information with, how to leave a phone message, the whole safety protocol. But that was definitely a concern. It's been a concern in every study. So we've developed a lot of methods over the years to try to keep safe. So one of the fundamental rules is you always go two people. You never go alone. One and the other is somebody else has to know where you are, and if you don't show up within an hour, they're going to have to look at someone. And we didn't have, I think one interview was in mud, but that happens all the time. That's something that could happen all the time, so we can't really say anything. Well, it's true. Get mud. So yeah.
I'll have another question in the context. Did you ever have trouble getting that information from the child? Because you have to feel very comfortable give out this information. This was like.
Absolutely. So one of the things we thought was very important. So there's both the ethical and the methodological here. So one is you never want to force a kid to tell you something that methodologically and data. There's a lot of research or a lot of been written about because kids on the street are very to survive they have to be very smart, and they're really good at telling adults what they think you want to hear. And so we made our first contacts with them. We made it very clear we would let them choose what to tell us. So that's why we did the life history. Tell us what you think is important about your life. Rather than going with a whole bunch of questions like, has this happened? So that was really good. And what we found is because we did repeated interviews with them, that often at the second interview they'd say, no, that's not my love about blind. Let's do the interview again. Or, I know I told you this, but I really should have told you this too. So that's why we use all the data they tell us because it's the first time. And that's also why we do ecological engagement, because by the time they invited you to the study and they start providing data, they already know you were enough to trust them. But one thing's really interesting, so we don't pay our participants in Brazil, which my IRB has had problems with in the past. But the reason we don't pay them are two reasons. One is that it's, culturally it's very not acceptable. In fact, in Mexico, we don't either, because people will get upset or insulted. With the college students, we do a little snack. But even that, because people, culturally, you don't pay people. But with the street kids, we don't pay them for a couple of reasons. One is it could actually put them in danger. People knew we were giving them money. And two, they can get money because they can get money from adults. I mean, they can beg, they can steal. Money is not the issue. Being listened to and heard with respect is just so hugely, it's something that I don't get very often. And so the first study I did was held like 1992. We had kids who wanted to be interviewed over and over again. Like they would come back and say, oh, I did the interview yesterday, I had a great time, can I do it again? And we're like, no, I'm going to interview you once. But they just, the idea that here is an adult from a university sitting down and listening to me is just incredible. So that's kind of usually sort of I don't know if that's a cultural thing. But you find it here too, being heard is very powerful too. And then we give them what we call non-material resources, so we give them referrals, or if they need help, getting ID. A lot of people don't have proper ID, so our interviewers would take them to their ID or refer them to people. I'll send you a little question. Other questions?
In regards to the street kids, I know it sounds like you did multiple studies. I don't think I saw as far as the number of subjects that was used in each of those studies. I'm curious, is it like 6 kids? Are you talking like 20 kids, 200 kids? Like how many? And as far as geographic, is it, Brazil's a big place, you know, so I was curious if it's like one central location or Rio or whatnot.
So the last study, we were in the 3 places I showed you, Salvador, Fortaleza,
I mean, I saw that briefly.
yeah, I know that. Oh. So, the study, the last study, the longitudinal, we had kids from Fortaleza, Salvador, and Porto Alegre. That was the 113 we started with. Previously, in Porto Alegre down here, my colleague and I, which is where we've done most of our work, we've done 5 studies with between 25 and 80 participants. I was part of a group that did a study in 10 Brazilian cities. That wasn't necessarily street kids, it was impoverished youth, and that data set, I think, has 12,000 kids in it. And then I was involved as a postdoc. I worked in Belo Horizonte, a city that is not shown here. And we had multiple studies, but I think we had about 400. So depending on the study, our N can be as small as 25 or 10,000. And that's why when you're working with, especially when you do small studies, it's really important to do replication and see if you're getting around. So, yeah.
In regards of like the recent Olympics in Rio and everything, would you ever want to like repeat the process there since there was such a grand event happening there and possibly a different economical context as well?
You mean do another study?
Yeah, well in Rio, see if it's like different just because there's a giant event. I'm not sure what regards to it.
Yeah. That's a really good question. A lot of the cities you worked in had been part of the World Cup. And there had been a lot of cleaning up of the cities beforehand. And we actually had to plan our data collection so we didn't disrupt it. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Rio, they did a lot of dislocating the populations and knocking down neighborhoods to try to free up space and also just get rid of poor areas. It'd be really interesting to do. I've never done research in Rio. Although I mentored a young woman who's doing research there. I don't know. That'd be interesting. I probably wouldn't want it. It's a lot of work. It's a really hard city to work in because it's so big and there are so many agencies. But it would be interesting. I mean, when those big political or sort of big international events impinge on the country, they can really change the dynamic.
Thank you.